Thank you everyone for being here for this talk with Jessica and Brittany from the Census Bureau. We're very lucky to have them here to talk about the new redistricting data set and some of the changes that have been made to how race and ethnicity are coded, tell us a little bit more about how demographics are shifting in the United States, and then also show us some really great resources from the Census website to allow you to access and visualize those data sets. So with that said, I will turn it over to Jessica and Brittany.
Thanks, Aiden. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And if everybody can see my screen, we can go ahead and get started. Okay. Good afternoon. We're honored to meet with you today to provide highlights from the 2020 census. The 2020 census data provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition and the racial and ethnic diversity of our nation. To help congressional and state officials, researchers, the media, and the public examine the redistricting statistics for the nation, for your state and county, and other areas across the country, we released 2 America Count stories, shown here and available on our website. Together, the stories provide a new snapshot of our nation's population and how interconnected we are. We framed the 2020 census data historically, with a new data visualization we released on our website. I encourage you to explore the interactive data visualization to understand how the concepts of race and ethnicity are measured and how the statistics are collected and coded. This has changed every decade, reflecting social, political, and economic factors throughout our nation's history. The 2020 census data enable us to understand how the racial and ethnic composition and the racial and ethnic diversity of the U.S. population looked in 2020. Before we present the results, the next series of slides show images of the 2020 Hispanic Origin question and the 2020 race question, and provide an overview of the improvements made for the 2020 census. So it's important to note that the Census Bureau collects race and ethnicity data in accordance with the 1997 standard for maintaining, collecting, and presenting federal data on race and ethnicity directed by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. Therefore, the designs of the 2020 census questions on Hispanic origin and race are similar to the designs used in the 2000 and 2010 censuses. While the Census Bureau tested an alternative question design in 2015, we must ultimately follow the 1997 OMB standards and use 2 separate questions to collect data on race and ethnicity. Our testing, however, did show that we can make improvements to the 2020 census race and ethnicity questions within the OMB guidelines. Building on our extensive research and outreach last decade, we made several improvements to the questions for 2020. The 2020 census Hispanic origin question included the same 3 detailed checkboxes that were included in the 2010 census. So first being Mexican, Mexican-American, Chicano, second being Puerto Rican, third being Cuban, along with a yes, another Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin checkbox. There were 2 changes to the 2020 census Hispanic origin question. The instruction to print origin, for example, was revised to print, for example. In our research, we found that this revised instruction allowed respondents to understand what the question was asking them to report, and it did not limit their write-in response by confusing the instructions with terms like origin that mean different things to different people. And the example groups were revised from Argentinian, Colombian, Dominican, Nicaraguan, Salvadoran, Spaniard, and so on, to Salvadoran, Dominican, Colombian, Guatemalan, Spaniard, Ecuadorian, etc., in order to represent the largest Hispanic origin population groups and the geographic diversity of the Hispanic or Latino category, as defined by OMB's 1997 standards. We also made several design improvements to the race question for the 2020 census, based on our research over the past decade. In response to community feedback over the past decade, we added dedicated write-in response areas and examples for the white and Black or African American racial categories. We provided 6 example groups for each of the white, Black or African American, and American Indian or Alaska Native racial categories. These examples represent the largest population groups within each of the geographically diverse population groups of each race category, as defined by the 1997 OMB standards. Based on successful previous testing, the term Negro was removed from the 2020 census by updating the category Black, African Am, or Negro to Black or African Am on paper questionnaires and Black or African American on electronic instruments. We reordered detailed Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander checkboxes by population size. We changed the checkbox category Guamanian or Chamorro to Chamorro based on research and positive stakeholder feedback. We updated the write-in instructions for the Some Other Race category to better solicit detailed reporting. The 2010 form included the instruction to print race, but we updated the 2020 form to read print race or origin to correspond with the overall question instruction to mark one or more boxes and print origins. Okay, this slide provides a summary of the processing and coding improvements made to the 2020 Census Race and Hispanic Origin questions. Coding is a process we use to assign numeric codes to write-in responses in our questions, and we use numeric codes when we process and tabulate the data. In the 2010 census, we only captured the first 30 characters of two write-in responses in each write-in line and more detailed responses to the questions. For the 2020 census, we wanted to fully and accurately reflect the complex details of how people identify their race and ethnicity. So based on further research, testing, and outreach throughout the decade, we changed how we captured and coded responses for the 2020 census race and Hispanic origin questions. So we increased the number of characters captured from 30 to 200, which allowed us to capture and fully recognize longer write-in responses. And instead of prioritizing multiple responses into only 2 codes, we coded it to 6 detailed codes for each write-in area. This increase effectively gave all responses an equal opportunity to be coded into one of the 6 major race categories. It also simplified our coding work that removed duplicate or repetitive terms to reduce responses to 2 codes. We fully tested these coding and question changes in the 2015 National Content Test and finalized them in the 2018 census tests. So these examples illustrate how a response was coded in 2010 versus 2020 based on differences I just described. So the first example shows that in 2010, the response of Mexican American Indian, Portuguese, and African American was not fully coded because it was longer than 30 characters. Only the text outlined by the red box was captured and coded in the 2010 census. The additional text was not captured. Therefore, the responses of Portuguese and African American were not able to be coded. The second example shows that if the same write-in response was provided in 2020, all of the text outlined in the red box was captured. This enables all 3 terms of Mexican American Indian, Portuguese, and African American to be recognized and coded. So during the 2010 census, if someone provided more than 2 write-in responses in the Hispanic origin question write-in area, we prioritized coding Hispanic groups over race groups. In the 2020 census, subject matter experts coded what they saw, coding up to 6 responses from left to right, regardless of Hispanic origin or race group. This enabled all responses to be treated equally. This coding change does not impact the Hispanic origin data for the 2020 census redistricting file. In 2010, the example write-in response of Black, Colombian, and Peruvian was coded as Colombian and Peruvian, and the response of Black was not coded because it is a race response. For the redistricting data, this response was tabulated as part of the Hispanic or Latino category. In 2020, we coded all 3 responses, and all of these codes are retained internally for research purposes. For the official redistricting file tabulations, this response is tabulated as Hispanic or Latino. Following the 1997 OMB standards, respondents can only be Hispanic or not Hispanic. As long as the respondent provides at least 1 Hispanic origin response, they're tabulated as Hispanic. So the 2010 census used a complex series of coding rules to determine how to prioritize and assign up to 2 codes for each unique text string. In 2010, if more than 2 groups were part of a write-in text string on the same line in the race question, we prioritized coding race groups over Hispanic origin groups or other types of responses because we were limited to only coding 2 responses. In 2020, our subject matter experts coded what they saw, coding up to 6 responses from left to right, regardless of race group or Hispanic origin, enabling all responses to be treated equally. On this slide, we can see how this improvement to the coding rules impacted our final data by recognizing the rich and complex detailed identities reported by respondents. So let's look at this example of the write-in Cuban, Thai, Filipino. In 2010, even though Cuban was written first, as shown in the green text, the responses of Thai and Filipino were prioritized over Cuban because they are detailed race groups. Cuban was not coded or included in race tabulations because the 2 race groups were prioritized over it in coding. The redistricting data tabulates major race groups, so this response was tabulated as part of the Asian race category, representing Thai and Filipino in 2010. In 2020, all 3 groups in the write-in response were coded, and the tabulation would be Asian, representing Thai and Filipino, and some other race, representing Cuban. So as described in the previous slides, we improved the way we process the data and code the responses to these questions. The improvements and changes enable a more thorough and accurate depiction of how people self-identify, yielding a more accurate portrait of how people report their Hispanic origin and race within the context of a 2-question format. These changes reveal that the US population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than we measured in the past. We're confident that differences in the overall racial distributions are largely due to improvements in the design of the 2 separate questions for race data collection and processing, as well as some demographic changes over the past 10 years. We're also confident, as shown in our research over the past decade, that using a single combined question for race and ethnicity in the decennial census would ultimately yield an even more accurate portrait of how the US population self-identifies, especially for people who self-identify as multiracial or multi-ethnic. So in the next series of slides, we'll discuss the results of the 2020 census. So the 2020 census illuminates the racial and ethnic composition of the US. The first component of this composition is shown on the current slide for ethnicity statistics, which comes from the Hispanic origin question. From these data, we know that the Hispanic or Latino population numbered 62.1 million in 2020. And on the next slide, we have the second component of this composition for racial statistics. These statistics come from a separate question on race. To frame the discussion of racial composition, we use the concepts of race alone, race in combination, and race alone or in combination. These concepts have been in place since the 2000 census, and the 3 concepts are central to understanding our country's changing demographics. So the 2020 census statistics provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition of the country, and we'll take a look at the results on the next series of slides. So on the first slide, we see the white population remains the largest race or ethnicity group in the US, with 204.3 million people identifying as white alone, and 235.4 million people identifying as white alone or in combination with another race group. Next, we see the 2 or more races population, also referred to as the multiracial population, that was measured at 33.8 million people in 2020. Next, we see the sum of the race alone or in combination population at 49.9 million, surpassed the Black or African American alone or in combination population, which was 46.9 million, as the second largest race alone or in combination group. The next 3 slides, we'll see the next largest racial population, which was Asian, alone or in combination, with 24 million people. The American Indian and Alaska Native population, alone or in combination group, with 9.7 million people. and the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, an alone or in combination group with 1.6 million people. So I'll now pass the presentation along to my colleague, Brittany.
Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, everyone. So on the next series of slides, we'll show that in the 2020 census for all race groups, their in-combination multiracial populations accounted for most of the overall changes in each racial category. So although the white alone population decreased by 8.6% since 2010, the white in combination population saw a 316% change during the same period. So while the Black or African American alone population grew 5.6% since 2010, when we take a look at the Black or African American in combination population, we can see that it grew by 88.7%. And over the past 10 years, the American Indian and Alaska Native in combination population increased by 160%. So next, if we take a look at the Asian population, the Asian alone population grew by 35.5% between 2010 and 2020. And in comparison, the Asian in combination population grew 55.5% since 2010. And the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone population grew by 27.8% between 2010 and 2020. And in comparison, the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander in combination population grew slightly faster by 30.8% since 2010. And then the some other race in combination population changed 733% since 2010. So it's important to note that these comparisons between the 2020 census and the 2010 census race data should be made with caution, taking into account the improvements we have made to the Hispanic origin and race questions, to data processing, and to the ways we code what people tell us, which we discussed earlier in the presentation. Accordingly, data from the 2020 census show different but reasonable and expected distributions from the 2010 census for the white alone population, some other race alone or in combination population, and the multiracial population, especially for people who identify as both white and some other race. So on the next slide, we'll discuss the largest multiracial groups in the 2020 census. So the largest multiracial groups were white and some other race at 19.3 million, white and American Indian and Alaska Native with 4 million, white and Black or African American at 3.1 million, white and Asian at 2.7 million, and Black or African American and some other race with 1 million. So on the next slide, we present another way to examine data on race and ethnicity, which is to cross-tabulate Hispanic or Latino origin by race. And this was done for Census 2000, for 2010 census, and also in the 2020 census as the Redistricting Table P2, which provides cross-tabulated Hispanic by race statistics. So when we display the table shell from the 2020 census table P2, we can see that the Hispanic or Latino population is shown as a distinct table row at the top, followed by the not Hispanic or Latino population, and then a cross-tabulation of the not Hispanic or Latino population for these 6 not Hispanic race alone groups, and then the full set of 57 not Hispanic multiple race combinations. So to illustrate the results from the cross-tabulation of Hispanic origin by race data, this graphic compares percent change in racial identification among the Hispanic or Latino population on the left, and percent change among the not Hispanic or Latino population on the right. So the number of people of Hispanic or Latino origin who identified as white alone decreased by 52.9%, down from 26.7 million to 12.6 million over the 10-year period. And between 2010 and 2020, the number of people of Hispanic or Latino origin reporting more than one race increased from 3 million, 6%, to 20.3 million, 32.7%. And this is a 567% change. So on the next slide, we further describe the results in our America Count story with an overview of race and ethnicity in the United States. And these results are not surprising as they align with our expert research and corresponding findings this past decade about the impacts of question format on race and ethnicity reporting. These improvements more accurately illustrate the richness and complexity of how people identify their race and ethnicity in response to separate questions within the current OMB standards. And in a companion America Count story that we released on August 12th, we illustrate how the 2020 census results allow us to measure the nation's racial and ethnic diversity and how it varies at different geographic levels. So we explore multiple measures of racial and ethnic diversity. For these measures, we cross-tabulate the race and Hispanic origin statistics as data users often do, such as with the 2020 Census Redistricting Tables. So here we can see results that are not as impacted by the race reporting patterns of Hispanic or Latino respondents. So thus we are confident that the changes we're seeing from 2010 to 2020 in the diversity measures, which calculate mutually exclusive Hispanic origin by race groups, likely reflect actual demographic changes in the population over the past 10 years, as well as improvements to the question designs, data processing, and coding. So another way to understand the results from the 2020 census is to see how all racial and ethnic groups are distributed across the country to inform our understanding of diversity. So some people have different perceptions of what it means for a population to be diverse. Our definition for diversity refers to the representation and relative size of different racial and ethnic groups within a population. So diversity is maximized when all groups are represented in an area and have equal shares of the population. And we are using several approaches to measure the racial and ethnic diversity of the US population. And these include the Diversity Index, Prevalence Rankings, and the Diffusion Score, and a series of prevalence maps. And so for the interest of time, we're going to walk through the prevalence rankings and prevalence maps and discuss these results. So the first measure of diversity that I'll present are the prevalence ranking graphs. And these graphs show the percentage of the population that falls into the largest race or ethnic group, the second largest group, and the third largest group. So in this graph, the colors of the bars represent the different racial and ethnic groups shown in the legend on the left. And looking at the orange bars in column 1, we see the white alone, not Hispanic population was the most prevalent racial or ethnic group for all states, except for the states of California, Hawaii, New Mexico, and the District of Columbia, a state equivalent, as well as Puerto Rico. So on the next slide, in 2020, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, became the largest racial or ethnic group in California, comprising 39.4% of the total population, up from 37.6% in 2010. Black or African American, not Hispanic, shown in blue, was the most prevalent group in the District of Columbia. Asian, not Hispanic, shown in red, was the most prevalent group in Hawaii. And the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was also the most prevalent group in New Mexico and in Puerto Rico. So looking at the next image, we also saw shifts in the second most prevalent group for some states in 2020, and these are shown in the second column. So in West Virginia, the multiracial, not Hispanic population, shown in teal, at 4%, became the second most prevalent group. And in Wisconsin, the Hispanic or Latino population in green at 7.6% became the second most prevalent group. And then in Texas, the first most prevalent group and the second most prevalent group rankings did not change between 2010 and 2020, but the difference in size between the white alone, not Hispanic population in orange and the Hispanic or Latino population in green shrank to about 0.5%. And for the District of Columbia, the difference in the size of the Black or African American alone, not Hispanic population in blue, and the white alone, not Hispanic population in orange narrowed dramatically in 2020 to only a 2.9 percentage point difference, down from 15.2 percentage points in 2010. So another measure that we use is a series of prevalence maps to show geographic distributions and patterns in racial and ethnic diversity across the country. So this first map displayed here shows the most prevalent race or ethnicity group by county for 2020. In 2020, the white alone, not Hispanic population, shown in orange, was the most prevalent group in about 90% of counties. And the Black or African American alone, not Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the most prevalent group in some counties in the South. And the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was the most prevalent group in counties in the Southwest and West. In addition, the American Indian and Alaska Native alone, not Hispanic population, shown in purple, was the most prevalent racial or ethnic group in counties in Alaska, the Four Corners region, and the Upper Great Plains. So the next map shows that there's more variation for the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group that's shown here on this slide. So what we see now is that more racial or ethnic groups are represented and the patterns are not as tightly clustered in specific regions. So often these show an inverse relationship to the most prevalent group map, which we saw on the previous slide. So here, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was the second most prevalent group and spanned the entire continental United States with large numbers of counties in every region. And the multiracial, not Hispanic population, shown in teal, was the second most prevalent group in many counties throughout the northern part of the country, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. And counties where the Black or African American alone, not Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the second most prevalent group, are mostly concentrated in the South and also in parts of the Northeast and Midwest. In counties where the American Indian and Alaska Native alone, not Hispanic population, was the second most prevalent, is shown in purple, and are clustered in states that traditionally have large American Indian and Alaska Native populations, such as Oklahoma, Alaska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And the white alone, not Hispanic population, shown in orange, was the second most prevalent group in parts of the South and the West. And the Asian alone, not Hispanic population, shown in red, was the second most prevalent group in several counties throughout the Northeast, West, Alaska, and Hawaii. So as the country has grown, we have continued to evolve in how we measure the race and ethnicity of the people who live here. We use different approaches to illustrate the complexities of measuring racial and ethnic diversity across time and at different geographic levels. And to read about the statistics for your state and county, as well as other areas across the country, please check out the America Count stories on our website, census.gov. The improvements we have made for the 2020 census yield a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify in response to two separate questions on Hispanic origin and race. And our analysis of the 2020 census results showed that the US population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. So next slide. Okay, so the data we just discussed all come from the redistricting file that we recently released, but we have a lot more data to release from the 2020 census. There are two data products that we're really excited about are the demographic and housing characteristics file, and which is also known as the DHC, and the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file, or the detailed DHC. So our proposal for producing 2020 census detailed race and ethnicity group population counts and characteristics data focuses on tables that have been developed in an attempt to balance the programmatic, legal, and statistical needs of data users and stakeholders and the requirements of differential privacy. So we're planning to produce data for more detailed race and ethnicity groups than ever before, but at many fewer geographic levels, as well as fewer and less detailed tables, while balancing accuracy and privacy. Our highest priority is to provide the most accurate data possible for the critical statistics needed by detailed population groups, such as detailed Hispanic origin groups like Mexican, Guatemalan, Peruvian, and detailed race groups such as Chinese, Korean, Asian Indian, and we also have new detailed data on the Black and white populations. So this slide shows how data users may submit their feedback on the 2020 census data products, and we hope that you'll share this. So we will now provide a short demonstration of the data visualizations to help you explore the 2020 census data we presented today. So we're going to walk through the race and ethnicity in the United States data visualization and the racial and ethnic diversity. So Jessica will walk through accessing the data visualizations, and then afterwards I'll discuss how to access the data on data.census.gov. But for now, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jessica for the data visualization.
Thank you, Brittany. There is a little bit of a lag on my end, so let me know if you're not seeing, if it's not lining up with what I'm talking about. So this is the first visualization. So race and ethnicity in the United States, 2010 census and 2020 census. So internally, I just call it the blue one versus the diversity one, which is the green map. And they look identical otherwise. And so let's start looking at this one. This has the race by ethnicity data on this first tab. And then you can look at the Hispanic or Latino origin data on this tab. And so both tabs are laid out exactly the same. So they have these three questions up top. So what percentage was each group in 2020? How has each group changed since 2010? And what are facts for my state or county? So on this first tab, here you can filter what group you want to look at. So here, let's say that we change it to Black or African American alone or in combination. Let's try that again. And you see the map updated. So the second filter changes it from total population. You can narrow it, show the race data for the Hispanic population and then the not Hispanic population. I'll leave it on the total population for now. And so here on the left-hand side, what you see is the ranking percentage-wise for the Black or African American alone or in combination population. So the largest percentage or the largest share is in the District of Columbia at 44.2%. And then and so on. You'll see it's organized in this way. And it lines up with what we're seeing on the map, where the largest majority of the Black or African American alone or in combination population is concentrated in the South and in the Northeast. So let's go ahead and pick a state. If you click on the state from this drop-down menu and click the little arrow, it'll highlight the state the map for that state. And if you wanted to pull up a specific county, you can have it highlighted just like that. And so if you hover over, you can see the data for that county. So for the Black or African American alone or in combination population, it comprised 44.8% of the total pop in Fulton County. And you can see how the white alone or in combination population is at 44.9%. So really close between the white and Black populations. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the rankings percentage-wise for the percent Black or African American alone or in combination for the state of Georgia. And it'll have all the states listed out on this side. And then if you wanted to switch over, this shows how each group has changed. So it gives you the percent change between 2010 and 2020. And again, you can use these filters to change between the two. So we can put white alone or in combination, and it'll show the green is areas where the percent change is negative. So it's decreased between 2010 and 2020, or didn't grow as fast. A decrease of 1,955 people, for example, or looking at the percentage points. So what I like about the percent change maps that if you hover over it, it'll give you the 2010 percentage right next to the 2020. So then we can click on the What are facts for my state or county tab, and this gives it in more of a table format. So if we wanted to highlight, let's click Black or African American alone, total population, North Carolina, and Martin County. So now it'll give you the data for the US level, state level, and county level next side by side. So it gives you the total counts up top for 2020 and 2010. Then the information for the group that you've highlighted, so Black or African American alone or in combination at the US, state, and then county levels. And then it gives you the rankings. So the rankings at the nation level, and then the rankings here are state level. And then it ranks the percent change for the US and the state level down here. So now if we switch over to the Hispanic Origin tab, it provides the same 3 questions, just focusing on the Hispanic versus not Hispanic questions. So remember, it's a 2-question format, so that's why we have the data shown this way. So here, as we mentioned during the presentation, the Hispanic or Latino population is mostly concentrated in the Southwest. And you see Florida, Puerto Rico pop up on the map, and some parts in the Northeast. We have the rankings on the left-hand side, and you can also switch this to not Hispanic if you wanted to. We'll leave it on Hispanic for now. Here, let's click on Arizona. And so this is the Hispanic or Latino population for Arizona. So the state population, 30.7%. And you have the counties for Arizona listed by pop size on the left. And so let's highlight Maricopa County. We see 30.6% identified as Hispanic or Latino for the 2020 census. We can also see the percent change. So between 2010 and 2020, we see the negative percent change in green and these in purple. We see that for Maricopa County, we saw an increase from 29.6% in 2010 to 30.6% in 2020. And this was a 19.7% change, an increase of over 200,000 people identifying as in the 2020 census as Hispanic or Latino. And then all the data can be produced in this table format as well for this visualization. Now I'll switch over to the diversity one. And so this first one is the diversity index. I won't go over all the details about the diversity index since we didn't go over it during the presentation, but you can read about the diversity index up here. And we also included how it was calculated, or the equation. Sorry, it's a little glitchy right now. So here you can see the equation that was used, the references, all the information that you need down at the bottom. And so these are the prevalence rankings that we had taken a look at, and Brittany had walked us through. And you see the legend up top of all the different colors and what they stand for, what different racial or ethnic groups they represent. So that top bar is the US breakdown, and it has all the states down here. But you can also look at this for a specific state, and it'll show you the county rankings. So let's pull up Texas. There are a lot of counties in Texas, so we'll scroll through. But you'll see like the largest racial or ethnic group, it's predominantly orange and green, so white, not Hispanic or Latino. And usually it'll be like the inverse. So if it's not the largest group, then it'll be the second largest group for these two groups in the state of Texas. There are some counties, obviously, that are going to look a little differently. But that, I think this is a cool way to look at it. So if you wanted to look at the county data, for instance, like you can highlight specific county if you type it in. Texas is a hard example because there's so many you have to scroll through, but it'll highlight it and you can see what the data looked like for 2020. And you can also change the year, so you can change it to 2010 and see what these data look like for 2010. Okay, and next we'll look at the prevalence maps. And so this is very much like what Brittany already walked you through. It has the percentage of the counties that this group is the largest for down here, if you have it on the largest racial or ethnic group. So this is where we say the white alone, not Hispanic population is the largest racial or ethnic group in 90% of the counties. This is how we would get that data. If you switch to second largest, you see this table updates as well. So the Hispanic or Latino population was the second largest racial or ethnic group in over 1,100 counties across the US, or 36% of counties across the US. It updates the map as well. And you can also look at the third largest. And then we also have more of a table format at the end. So let's pull up North Carolina, let's say. And you'll see the US population over here, the state of North Carolina, and then at the county level down here. And it'll have the largest racial ethnic group, second largest, and third largest. And so while across the US, the largest racial group is white, second is Hispanic, third is Black or African American, you'll see that that shifts around a little bit in the state of North Carolina, where it's white, Black, and Hispanic. And the same for this specific county. And it'll show you the percentages from 2010 and 2020 on this view. So that's how you would use the two visualizations, and we're sending all the links to Aiden for him to forward them along to all of you. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and Brittany's going to share how to access the data tables on data.census.gov.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay. Okay, so the great thing that what Jessica shared about the data visualizations is that, you know, it's really interactive and you can see visually a lot of the changes at the nation, at the state, and at the county level. But another way to access the data is through data.census.gov. And this allows you to really drill down and look at geographies below the county level. So I'm going to show you how to use, how to access those tables on data.census.gov. So the first thing you'll need to do is just open up your browser, type in data.census.gov, and you'll be taken to the main landing page. And the most precise way to get to the redistricting tables is to click on Advanced Search. And then from Advanced Search, you're going to want to scroll down, and then you'll click on Surveys. And then you're going to, under Surveys, you're going to want to click on Decennial Census. And then under Decennial Census, you're going to search for Redistricting Data PL 94-171. So you're going to select that and then click on the search button on the lower right-hand corner. And here it'll take you to all of the results. We want to focus on the tables. So I'm clicking on the Tables tab. And you can see that there are 10 tables that they're all related to redistricting data. And the very first 6 tables that are shown here on the left-hand side of the screen are the 2020 redistricting tables. You'll also see that we have them available for 2010. So there's table H1, P1, P2, P3, P4, and P5 for the 2020 redistricting data. So let's say that we want to take a look at the Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino data by race. So we'll go ahead and click on table P2. And once you do that, you can see that just verify that the product is for 2020 decennial redistricting data. You'll want to always pay attention to the universe. Universe, here we're looking at the total population. So this table provides the total population counts, the counts for the Hispanic or Latino population, for the not Hispanic or Latino population, and then underneath the not Hispanic or Latino population, we have all of the different race groups, population for one race and population of 2 or more races. So there is another table that focuses on Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race data, but there's only one small difference, and that is table P4. So if you come back here to the left-hand side, you'll see table P4. And I'm going to refresh this because I'm not sure why I'm getting a system error. Okay. Another quick way to access the data is to just type in redistricting. But I wanted to show you all of the filters. So let me go back to P4. Okay. So here's table P4, and we can see that table P4 is the Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race for the population 18 years and over. So here the universe is total population 18 years and over. So the only difference between P2 and P4 is that P4 just drills down on 18 years and over population. So now the most important part probably of using these tables is, wanting to look at all the different geographies. So if we want to take a look at a different geography other than the state level, it defaults to the different states automatically. Here on the right-hand side, we can go to this filter tab, and then we're going to go down under browse filters and select geography. And let's say that we want to compare the nation, a state, a county, and then a city within that county. So I'm going to click on the United States, and here you can see, hopefully it still has, okay, here you can see we have United States selected, and then we can click on state, and you can scroll down to select a state, or you can type it here. Just type, I'm going to choose Texas, home state. And so then if we scroll back up, you'll see that you have the United States, Texas selected. Let's choose a county within Texas. So you'll want to have to select the state again. And then it'll list all the counties. I want to select Harris County. So now I have United States, Texas, Harris County, and then let's look at a place level. So here you can see these are all the different geographies. It goes down to the smallest census geography that we have, which is the block level. But there's lots of different types of geographies that you can explore to see which data is best for you. I'm going to click on place so we can take a look at, let's say, Houston in Texas. I'm just going to put it in. Okay, so now we have all the geographies we want. You're going to want to go ahead and click on this done. These two arrows, click done. And then now you can see that we have table P4. So I'm going to click on customize table and you'll be able to see the full screen of the table. You can see that we have the data for the United States, for Texas, for Harris County, and then for Houston City within Texas. But you can also add as many other geographies as you would like. You can also download these tables in Excel or download them as CSV files or as a PDF. So this is just another resource that you can use. The tables are, a nice way to go ahead and get the data if you want to work on it in Excel. For example, this is just one other way to access the redistricting data. So I want to thank you all for joining us here today for this discussion. And we're going to go ahead and turn it over for questions. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Aiden, who's going to help us get started on the questions.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much, Jessica and Brittany. This has been really awesome. And we've had a few questions come in the chat. So I know we were set, I think, to end around 3, but if it's good with everyone, we can maybe go a few minutes over to make sure we get through as many of these as possible. But first question was from Christina, I think relating to how you changed the questions, what the process for that was like. And so the question is, how did you set up the feedback sessions from these different ethnic and racial groups, and how interactive were those feedback sessions?
So this is from the 2015 National Content Test, and we have that included in the list of links. It gives you the full report on the full process. This was before Brittany and I's time at the Bureau, so we can definitely forward that along, all the information from the 2015 National Content Test and other testing that was happening throughout the decade to try to get us ready for 2020.
Kind of along those same lines, Christina's other question was, what drove the need for change and how we code with ethnicity? Why was that being necessary? So what was the kind of driving force behind changing those coding?
So the census has always, if you looked at that first graphic, we've changed the question every decade. Basically, there's been some kind of change since the beginning of the census. And it goes with the times, with the how people are identifying themselves, and how we see that we need to change the question in order to keep up with how people are reporting race and ethnicity in the United States. So right now we're still using the 1997 OMB standards. There was a lot of research done in the decade to potentially update those changes. Unfortunately, a decision was not made in time for the 2020 census, but we didn't receive any directive from OMB. So we had to move forward with the 1997 standards in preparation for the 2020 census. But because of the research that we had done, we could make some improvements based within the OMB standards. So that's adding the two write-in lines for white and black, and expanding the code list basically to include other groups that we can code, and and capturing more data in general.
Yeah, and I think I had a question around the same time kind of related to that. So what would be the necessary steps for moving from the 2-question format to the 1-question format? Is that something that OMB does on its own? Does there need to be legislation? How does that work?
It's from OMB. It's the Office of Management and Budget that would need to provide that guidance. So census can't make that decision on their own. We we don't really have as much power as a lot of people think over what our survey actually looks like. It still needs to be in line with what OMB is providing as guidelines. So it's in conjunction with experts from Census Bureau, with other federal statistical agencies. They work together to come up with the guidelines for any updates that are made to the OMB guidelines.
That's all the questions that came in through the chat throughout the presentation, but does anyone else have additional questions? Christina, I will ask you any.
Hi, thank you, Jessica and Brittany, so much for speaking with us today. I learned a lot, and I was honestly geeking out at all of the amazing data visualization. It's so robust. So I have two questions for both of y'all. It's a little bit more personal about like y'all's careers. So first, how did you get involved in the data space, and what do you love most about working in your field?
So Brittany, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I've always been interested, in my studies. My background is in sociology and demography. So I think, through my personal experiences and also through the research that I'd done through school, researching data on race and ethnicity was really where my heart was. So that's how I really got involved. In graduate school, I was able to do an internship at the US Census Bureau in the Fertility and Family Statistics branch. So that's how I was able to join the US Census Bureau and, kind of got a taste for what exactly the type of work is done, the data that we review. And then that's, of course, my research interests are in race and ethnicity. So eventually I was able to move to the race branch, which is where I'm at now. And I'm very excited to be here. But was there a second part to that question? I'm sorry.
It was what do you love most about working in your field?
Oh, what do I love most? I think the most exciting thing is that we get to review the data that comes in, first. So our job primarily is to make sure that the data looks reasonable and is sound before we release it to the public. So I think the most exciting thing is to be able to look at the changes that have occurred in race from 2010 to 2020, and just really, get to look at all those changes. I think that's probably the most exciting thing for me.
Okay, I can go now. So I have a background in sociology as well. I received my Ph.D. from the University of Maryland, College Park, in sociology in 2018. So I started interning at Census Bureau while I was working on my dissertation in 2017. And I started in the Ethnicity and Ancestry branch. So my research in the past is on Hispanic populations and how they identify racially. So it's spot on to what I'm doing now. So so that's how I ended up here. Whenever you're in a PhD program, you're always on the fence on whether or not you're going the academic route or looking for other opportunities. And the internship really helped me decide that this is where I wanted to be. So I'm a big supporter of trying out different internships in organizations that you might be interested in, since you never know where you're going to end up. So for what we do here, I would say, well, a lot of it is looking at what the data looks like. That's the fun part, looking at what it looks like before anybody else gets to see it, or making sure that it's actually lining up and making sense with what we're expecting. So there were a lot of changes, as you saw, between 2010 and 2020. And when we were making these comparisons in some of the census tests, we saw that major shift, especially for how Latinos were reporting on the race question. That is where we're seeing a lot of that shifting around. And having my background, I knew how Latinos responded to the race question typically, and how this was different. And being able to say, okay, well, this is definitely a lot of it is how we're coding things is differently. Our processes are different, and this is what's leading to such a big change. So it's really exciting to see. And it's like solving major problems and and getting these data available to everybody else that are used for so many different things. So it's great to be a part of such an important process.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one last question for both of y'all. So for young people, especially young people of color wanting to enter this space, or if you could travel back in time to meet a younger version of yourself, what words of encouragement or advice would you give them?
I would say, I think, at least for my experience in the earlier years in grad school, a lot of people were more interested in qualitative methodology because they felt like that's the way that they could connect most with people. And I feel like, while yes, that you can definitely connect people with qualitative methods, you can definitely do the same with quantitative methods. And I feel like, don't be afraid of like numbers, and like that was a lot of the around my friend group. It was a lot like, I don't really do that kind of work. I'm more interested in interviewing people and all of these, when statistics can be a tool to address a lot of major questions. So I feel like, don't be afraid to take those stats classes and put yourself out there and get that experience, because while it doesn't help that a lot of times they use not the most fun and things to as like demonstrations for for tools for learning, but you can see how great these data can, using stats can lead to this, what we've just shown today. So it's a lot of fun.
Wonderful. I want to thank you both so much. Your presentation was incredibly insightful, and we'll be sure to pass along all of the links. And thank you, not just for this presentation, but what you do at the Census Bureau. And thank you everyone else for attending as well.